In the depths of the Rockies, when the winter of 1867 gripped the land with an unforgiving freeze, one mountain man fought not only the elements, but the very forces of nature itself. Alone in his cabin, he faced a fire that would burn for 40 days, keeping him alive in a brutal battle for survival. But it wasn't just the fire that held the answer, it was his will to endure that made all the difference. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if survival stories like this one speak to your soul, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode holds even more untold adventures from the frontier. It was the last day of November when the storm arrived. Not the usual winter squall that blew through the Rockies every year, but something more malicious, something that felt as if the mountains themselves had decided to turn against the men who dared to live within them. The wind howled like a wolf on the hunt, and snow blanketed the earth in thick layers, stifling every sound except the crackling of the fire inside Samuel's cabin. Samuel Bridger sat by the hearth, his thick, gnarled hands tending to the fire as if it were his only companion. His grizzled beard and dark eyes spoke of years spent surviving in these harsh conditions. Today, however, survival was no longer a matter of hunting or trapping, it was a matter of keeping the fire alive. The walls of the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow, and the roof seemed to sag, inch by inch, as the storm piled layer after layer on top of it. He had seen storms before, but this one was different. He could feel it in his bones, the pressure building in the atmosphere, the cold creeping into the very marrow of his bones. The fire was burning hot, but it wouldn't last forever. Even seasoned mountain men like Samuel had to know that. Outside, the world had turned into a blinding white abyss. The trees that once stood tall and proud now bowed under the weight of the snow, and every step Samuel took was swallowed by the deep drifts. His supplies were dwindling, and with the roads impassable, there was no way to reach town for more. This storm had come to stay, and Samuel had to be ready. If the fire went out, the temperature inside the cabin would plummet, and his survival would depend on nothing more than sheer willpower. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the cabin walls. The snow piled higher against the windows. He checked the door again, making sure it was properly sealed. The last thing he needed was the cold creeping in through the gaps. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth a fragile barrier between him and the freezing wilderness outside. He had enough wood to last him the night, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to survive the days ahead. As he settled back onto his cot, staring at the flickering flames, Samuel realized that the battle had already begun. Not against the storm, nor the cold. No, this was a fight for his very sick life against the isolation, the relentless elements, and the quiet desperation that threatened to consume him with each passing hour. But Samuel had learned long ago that surviving the mountains wasn't about fighting nature, it was about learning to live with it. And in that moment, as the wind howled and the storm raged outside, he resolved to outlast it, whatever it took. It was the fourth day of the storm when Samuel realized the fire was more than just a means of survival, it was his last tether to the world. The snow outside had reached nearly 10 feet in some places, burying everything in a thick, silent tomb. He could no longer hear the sounds of wildlife, no birds, no distant howls, just the eternal white silence that had settled over the mountains. The fire had been the one constant. It had kept him warm, fed, and alive. But Samuel wasn't a fool. He knew that even the strongest fire could be extinguished. He had lived through many winters, had seen men perish because their fires had gone out during the coldest months. But he was different. His cabin was small, and his fuel supply wasn't endless. The wood stacked high against the walls would only last so long, and once it was gone, there would be no more. Each day, Samuel took stock of his provisions, buckets of dried meat, jars of salted fish, and sacks of grain. They would sustain him for weeks, perhaps months, if necessary. But without fire, it didn't matter how much food he had. Without heat, he would freeze to death before the storm ended. He had one chance to make it through this ordeal, keep the fire going no matter what. He had learned long ago that fire wasn't just a tool, it was a partner in survival. It was something to be nurtured and respected. Samuel had spent days perfecting his fire-building skills, making sure it would last through the night and into the cold mornings. He knew exactly how to layer the wood, how to make it burn slow and steady, how to coax it into life even in the worst of conditions. The fire wasn't just his warmth, it was his beacon. On the morning of the 6th day, as Samuel prepared to add another log to the fire, he heard a faint thud at the door. He froze. His heart skipped a beat as he waited, listening for any sound that might follow. The wind howled louder, masking any noise that might have come from outside. But there it was again, a quiet thump too deliberate to be a passing branch or a gust of wind. He stood up slowly, moving toward the door with caution. His rifle, ever within reach, was ready. But what could be out there? He hadn't seen another living soul in weeks. And yet the thud came again, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws on the wooden door. The fire, crackling behind him, seemed suddenly insignificant. There was something more immediate now, a threat just outside. With his heart pounding, Samuel reached for the door handle, fully aware that whatever awaited him outside could very well determine if he would make it through the storm. But whatever it was, it had to be dealt with now. The wind outside raged with the fury of 1,000 storms, but inside the cabin, Samuel stood still. His hand rested lightly on the door handle as he listened intently. The scraping sound outside was unmistakable, followed by the soft shuffle of something moving in the deep snow. It wasn't the wind this time. Someone or something was out there. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. In all his years in the mountains, he had never experienced anything quite like this. Bears and wolves were expected, the occasional rogue mountain lion too, but human visitors? That was rare in these parts, especially during such a fierce storm. No one ventured out here without a damn good reason. The scraping sound continued, rhythmic and purposeful. He tightened his grip on the rifle that sat by his side, his fingers cold against the wooden stock. He hadn't planned on any visitors, not today, not in the middle of a storm that was turning the world into a frozen wasteland. He could feel the tension in his muscles, every nerve on alert. One wrong move, and he might end up facing the barrel of a gun, or worse, a hungry predator. But there was no choice now. He had to know who or what was out there. With a slow, deliberate motion, Samuel stepped away from the door and positioned himself near a narrow window, just large enough for him to peer out. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, his eyes scanning the snow-covered ground outside. For a moment, he saw nothing but the endless white. The storm made it almost impossible to see clearly, but then, through the swirling snow, he saw movement, a figure, hunched low to the ground, moving toward the cabin. Samuel's hand tightened on the rifle. The figure was close now, and Samuel's heart began to race. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or wolf, it was a man. Stumbling through the snow, his face covered with a thick beard and layers of furs. He was moving slowly, exhausted, barely able to keep his balance in the harsh wind. The man's steps faltered as he neared the cabin, and Samuel felt a rush of relief mixed with confusion. A fellow trapper? A lost soul looking for shelter? Before Samuel could make a decision, the man collapsed to his knees in the snow, barely visible through the blur of the storm. Samuel hesitated for only a moment. If he was going to help this man, he had no time to waste. With a quick motion, he grabbed the door handle and threw open the door, the bitter wind biting at his face as it rushed into the cabin. The stranger looked up in shock, his wide eyes locking with Samuel's. There was no sign of malice, only a deep desperation. "I need help," the man gasped, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, I'm lost." Without another word, Samuel stepped forward, pulling the man into the warmth of the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, and the storm's fury was momentarily silenced, replaced by the crackling warmth of the fire. Samuel helped the stranger to his feet, steadying him as he stumbled. "Name's Samuel," he said, his voice gruff. "You're safe for now, but you've got to stay near the fire. The storm outside won't let up." The man nodded weakly, his face pale from exhaustion and cold. Samuel wasn't sure how long he'd been out there, but the man clearly wasn't in good shape. The warmth of the cabin was the first real comfort he'd had in days. The stranger collapsed into the nearest chair, unable to hold himself upright any longer. As the man caught his breath, Samuel went to the fire, stoking it higher with a few logs, the flames dancing in the hearth. There would be time to talk later, after the storm passed. But for now, the stranger needed warmth, food, and rest. Samuel moved quietly around the cabin, gathering a bowl of stew and a thick blanket. He placed both in front of the stranger, who barely looked up, his eyes glazed over with fatigue. "You're safe now," Samuel said, his voice low. "Rest. We'll figure the rest out later." Outside, the storm raged on, but for the moment, the cabin was a sanctuary, a brief reprieve from the unforgiving wilderness. The storm did not let up. Hours passed, or maybe days, Samuel couldn't tell for sure. The cabin's small, dimly lit interior had become a world unto itself, the fire the only source of life against the howling cold outside. Samuel kept a careful watch on the stranger, who had drifted in and out of consciousness, exhausted from the elements. The man's name, when he finally spoke it, was Jacob, a fellow prospector who had been caught out in the storm, separated from his camp, and lost in the relentless whiteout. Jacob's tale was a familiar one. A simple mistake, a delayed return, and the storm had taken him. But his survival was less about luck than sheer will, something Samuel knew well. The fire, the warmth, the shelter, these were more than just luxuries in the mountains. They were necessities, and without them, the wilderness could easily claim you. Samuel had learned that lesson the hard way, many years ago, when he lost a companion to the cold. That experience had shaped everything he did since, from his approach to building a fire to the way he prepared for a winter storm. Jacob was lucky. The fire was the key to survival. "Thank you," Jacob murmured, as he took a few tentative bites of the stew Samuel had prepared. His hands shook as he held the bowl, his body still recovering from the cold. Samuel nodded, watching the man carefully. There was a sense of urgency in Jacob's eyes, but Samuel knew better than to rush someone in a moment like this. The fire crackled, its warmth casting long shadows on the log walls. Samuel knew they couldn't stay inside forever. They'd have to face the storm again eventually. He kept glancing toward the window, watching the swirling snow. It was nearly impossible to tell when the storm might end, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became to venture out. The night was still. Jacob slept intermittently, his body fighting the cold even within the warmth of the cabin. Samuel, on the other hand, stayed awake, tending to the fire, aware that it was only a matter of time before the situation would escalate. When the storm broke, they would need to move perhaps towards the nearest town, or to find Jacob's lost camp, but for now, all they could do was wait. And as they sat in silence, the weight of the wilderness settled over Samuel once again. This storm was a reminder of how quickly things could turn, how survival depended not on strength, but on preparation, vigilance, and sometimes a little bit of luck. He had made it this far. Jacob, for all his struggles, might too, but only if the fire stayed alive. The wind howled louder than ever, pushing against the walls of the cabin like a living thing. Each gust sent a tremor through the logs, and Samuel could feel the cold seep deeper into the wood. The fire crackled, fighting to stay alive, but it was clear to him that the warmth was starting to fade. The storm was relentless, a constant reminder of just how fragile survival was out here. Jacob stirred in his sleep, his face flushed with fever. Samuel had been keeping a watchful eye on him, but it was clear that the man wasn't recovering as quickly as he'd hoped. Fever wasn't something that could be wished away, and Samuel knew the dangers that came with it. If Jacob didn't improve soon, he'd be in more trouble than either of them could handle. Samuel's gaze drifted to the small pile of firewood stacked in the corner. It was enough to last a few more days if used sparingly, but with the storm showing no signs of abating, Samuel wasn't so sure. He had learned long ago that in the mountains, resources were never as plentiful as they seemed. He had to be smart, rationing everything: food, firewood, and energy. Every decision mattered when survival was at stake. The storm had trapped them in this small cabin, and though the fire kept them warm, Samuel knew it wouldn't be enough to protect them forever. There was only so much the cabin could offer, and with Jacob ill, the situation was becoming dire. He grabbed his rifle and went to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. The world outside was obscured by snow, a swirling white chaos that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The landscape had disappeared into a frozen, lifeless void. As he turned away from the window, Samuel's eyes lingered on Jacob, still curled up on the cot. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he had stopped shivering. That was something at least. The fever had started to break. Still, Samuel couldn't shake the worry that lingered in his gut. If Jacob didn't get better, soon they would be stuck here, trapped in the storm, with no way to reach help. Samuel knelt beside the fire and stoked the embers, watching as the flames briefly flared before settling again. He needed to make a decision. The longer they stayed here, the more likely they would run out of supplies. If Jacob didn't recover soon, Samuel would have no choice but to venture out into the storm, even if it meant risking his own life to get help. The storm had already claimed so much the path to safety was a dangerous gamble. But in this wilderness, there was no room for hesitation. Time was a luxury that no man had in the mountains. Turning to the bed, Samuel grabbed his coat and strapped his rifle to his back. He didn't want to leave Jacob alone, but he knew what he had to do. His instincts as a survivor told him the time had come to face the storm, no matter what it cost. The cabin was still for a moment, the only sound the steady crackle of the fire, but soon the door creaked open, and Samuel stepped out into the fury of the storm. The wind hit him like a physical force, biting at his face with sharp, cold fingers. His breath formed clouds in the air, and he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, bracing himself for the fight ahead. Outside, the world was a frozen blur, the snow falling in thick, heavy sheets. The visibility was nearly non-existent, and each step Samuel took felt like it might be his last. His boots sank into the deep snow, each step a challenge. But he had no choice. Jacob needed help. The fire would only last so long, and Samuel couldn't wait any longer. He pushed forward, cutting through the storm with slow, deliberate steps. Every few minutes, he paused to catch his breath, to listen for any sounds beyond the storm's roar. But there was nothing. The wilderness had swallowed everything, no birds, no distant sounds of animals, not even the hum of a river or stream, just the wind, screaming its fury against him. It was hard to tell how much time had passed. The storm's whiteout conditions made it impossible to gauge direction, and every tree or rock looked the same, buried under snow. Samuel tried to keep a mental map in his head, remembering the way back to his cabin, but with each step, it became harder to stay oriented. His only guide was the instinct that had kept him alive for so many years in the mountains. A few hours passed, or maybe more. Samuel wasn't sure. His legs were starting to ache, the cold creeping deeper into his bones. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He had to find help before it was too late. Then, through the veil of snow, Samuel saw something, a shadow, barely visible through the storm. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he thought he was imagining things. But no, the shadow was real. It was a cabin, half hidden in the snow, a faint outline against the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of life, of safety. Samuel quickened his pace, his legs burning with each step. He was almost there, almost within reach of help. When he reached the cabin, he slammed his hand against the door, desperate. A moment later, it creaked open, and a face appeared in the doorway. A man, grizzled and weathered, wearing the clothes of a trapper. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Samuel, a stranger, standing before him, frozen but alive. "What in the hell?" the man started. But Samuel didn't have time for words. He pushed past the man, stumbling inside the cabin and collapsing against the wall. "I need help," Samuel gasped, still struggling to catch his breath. "A man's dying out there. He needs warmth, food, anything." The trapper looked at him, eyes narrowing in concern. Without a word, he moved to the fire and began stoking it, already grabbing blankets and supplies. There was no time for pleasantries, only action. In the mountains, you didn't ask questions. You just helped. The storm raged outside. But in this cabin, Samuel had found the lifeline he so desperately needed. And with that, the fight to save Jacob had just become a little bit easier. Samuel trudged back through the storm, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the cold bit into him with every step. His legs burned, and the snow was now waist-deep in some places, making progress slow and exhausting. But his mind was focused on one thing: Jacob. The stranger was still in the cabin, unconscious, barely clinging to life. Samuel had gotten help, but it had come at a cost. The trek back felt endless. Every step forward seemed to take him deeper into the blinding whiteness, and every few yards, the howling wind grew louder, pushing against him. But the cabin, his sanctuary, was still ahead. It had to be. He had no choice but to keep going. The other trapper had provided supplies, food, firewood, and even some herbal medicine to help Jacob with the fever. But the longer Samuel stayed away, the more danger Jacob would be in. Time was running out. With each step, Samuel's body ached more, his muscles sore from exhaustion. But he gritted his teeth, unwilling to give up now. The fire in the cabin had been their lifeline, and now it was his turn to return that favor. The storm didn't care about him or his needs, but he couldn't let the wilderness take another life today. Finally, through the thick curtain of snow, he saw the outline of the cabin. Samuel pushed forward, his pace quickening as the warmth of the fire promised safety. The door creaked open as he stepped inside, the heat from the flames welcoming him back. "Jacob," Samuel called out, his voice hoarse. The man's form still lay on the cot, but the fever had broken. There was hope now. Jacob was awake by the time Samuel returned, his fever having subsided slightly. His eyes were clearer, no longer clouded by delirium. As Samuel stoked the fire and added more wood, he could see the gratitude in Jacob's gaze. "Thank you," Jacob whispered, his voice weak but steady. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Samuel shook his head, refusing to accept the praise. "We help each other out here. That's how we survive." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Samuel settled beside it, taking a moment to rest his weary bones. He was exhausted, but there was still work to do. There was a man's life to save, and that meant making sure Jacob was strong enough to travel when the storm passed. The storm outside had softened, but the white landscape was still wild and untamed. It had tested Samuel's limits and Jacob's endurance. Now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the weight of survival felt slightly less heavy. Jacob, despite the toll the storm had taken on him, had learned something that night, a truth about the wilderness, about survival, and about the bond between two men caught in its unforgiving grip. It wasn't just about enduring the cold or facing the storm, it was about finding strength when all seemed lost, and knowing that help was always just a fire away. As the days stretched on, the storm outside began to weaken. The winds that had howled like wolves for so long started to subside, and the snow fell more gently, as if the mountains themselves had grown tired of the fight. Inside the cabin, Samuel and Jacob rested, taking stock of their situation, each day a slow recovery from the ordeal they had just endured. The fire never once went out, its warmth a constant reminder of what had been survived. Jacob, despite his fragile condition when Samuel had found him, was improving. His fever had broken completely, his strength gradually returning with each passing hour. Samuel watched over him, making sure he ate and rested, as the cabin slowly came back to life. The storm outside may have diminished, but the feeling of isolation and danger still clung to the air. The silence between the two men was comfortable now, a reflection of the quiet understanding they shared. Samuel had never been one for many words, but the shared ordeal had forged a bond between them that required no explanation. Jacob understood the mountains in a way that many men never would. And Samuel, for all his years of survival, knew that he had just been part of something bigger than himself. The fire crackled as Samuel added another log to the flame, his eyes wandering to the window where the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. The wilderness was not a place for the weak, and Samuel knew it had a way of humbling even the strongest. The storm had tested both of them. It had taken something from them and, in return, given them a chance to survive. But it also left behind a feeling of unease, as if the mountains were quietly watching them, waiting for their next move. Jacob's voice broke the silence, weak but steady. "How long until the storm passes?" Samuel glanced outside again, watching the last of the snowflakes float down from the sky. The worst was over. "It'll be clear in a few hours," he said. "We've got time." Jacob nodded, staring into the flames as if looking for something more than just heat. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the tension of the past days hanging in the air. Outside, the world was changing. The heavy snow that had buried the landscape was now shifting. The once frozen ground would soon become a treacherous landscape of melting drifts, and the wildlife would be more active in the coming days. The danger was never truly over on the frontier. It was simply waiting to strike when you least expected it. Samuel stood up and walked toward the door, opening it just enough to peek outside. The sun was beginning to shine through the clouds, casting long, pale light across the white expanse. The storm was fading, but its scars would remain. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, "we head out. We need to find your camp and get your gear." Jacob's eyes met Samuel's, and the unspoken understanding passed between them. They had survived the storm, but now they had to face the mountains once again. The cold would still be there, the wilderness would always be there, watching, waiting. But for now, they had the warmth of the cabin, the fire, and each other. That was enough. The morning after the storm had passed was a strange one, clear skies, a deceptive calm. The snow still clung to the earth, but it had hardened into a brittle crust that made every step an effort. The world was transformed, a glittering wilderness that, at first glance, seemed peaceful, even inviting. But Samuel knew better. Out here, peace was a fragile thing. It was earned with every day you survived, and even then, it was fleeting. Samuel and Jacob stood outside the cabin, bundled in furs and coats, surveying the path ahead. The snow crunched underfoot as they prepared to leave the safety of the cabin behind. Jacob had recovered enough to travel, and the supplies they had gathered from the other trapper's cabin were sufficient to get them back on track. The real work, though, was yet to come. They would have to traverse the mountains to find Jacob's camp, retrieve his gear, and assess the damage. And with the change in the weather, the risks were high. "You ready?" Samuel asked, his voice low, as usual. Jacob nodded, still a little unsteady on his feet, but determined. "I've got no choice," Jacob said, his voice rough from days of fever and rest. "I'm ready." Samuel gave him a small nod. The man was strong, and Samuel had no doubt that he would make it. Survival in the mountains wasn't about brute strength, it was about resolve, and Jacob had that in spades. They moved out, carefully picking their way through the snowdrifts, the mountainside stretching endlessly before them. The air was cold but clear, and the sun, though weak, gave them enough light to navigate. Samuel kept his rifle close, his senses sharp, knowing that the wilderness could turn hostile at any moment. The journey was slow. Every step in the deep snow was a battle, but Samuel was used to this. He had made countless journeys in these conditions, and this one felt different. There was a purpose now. They weren't just surviving, they were moving forward. As they walked, the silence between them felt more like a mutual understanding than a lack of conversation. They didn't need to speak much. They both knew the risks, the stakes, and the harsh reality of life in the mountains. Out here there were no guarantees, only the hope of reaching the next shelter, the next fire, the next step toward survival. It wasn't long before they reached the spot where Jacob's camp had once stood. The shelter was barely recognizable, collapsed under the weight of the snow. The pile of firewood was buried, and the gear was scattered in the snow, but the two men moved quickly, collecting what they could salvage. When the work was done, Jacob turned to Samuel, a tired but grateful look in his eyes. "Thank you," Jacob said simply, the words carrying more weight than any elaborate speech. Samuel nodded, the flicker of a smile crossing his face for the first time in days. "You'd do the same for me," he replied, turning back toward the cabin. There was still much to be done, but the worst was over. They had faced the storm together, and together they had survived. As they walked back toward the cabin, the mountains loomed in the distance, majestic and unforgiving. But Samuel wasn't afraid. He had learned, long ago, that survival was a quiet victory, a victory earned by those who refused to give up, no matter what the wilderness threw their way. And as they disappeared into the white expanse, the mountains whispered their quiet, eternal challenge: survive or be claimed.